Alright, y'all, so let's get into this next point. With that, keeping that last point in mind, that was kind of like setting up the building blocks to what a patient could be looking at when looking at a diagnosis or for different illnesses or diseases. That's looking at more of an outside-in perspective as to what they mean from a cultural or societal different point of view. For this next part, we're going to be talking about what it means to the patient from an internal point of view. Because you got to keep in mind, this is not a one-size-fits-all sort of matter. From person to person, it's going to look different because of the culture or the background that they grew up in. So you have to keep that in mind. And because it's going to look different, you have to look at the patient's explanatory model. And pretty much what that essentially means, how does the patient view these things, or how do they explain them to the doctor? Because once again, I'm going to say it a lot, but this is not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. It's going to be different from person to person. So what somebody might view as a cold might be a flu to somebody else. Well, medically, they're not going to be the same thing necessarily. They're just going to be taken as a different sort of illness from one person to another. So that's something you have to keep in mind when a patient themselves is talking about how they're presenting their illness or disease to a doctor. So with that in mind as well, you have to remember that this is a patient-first point of view here. So how the patient's going to be describing it, how the patient describes that they want to be treated when issuing treatments for such a disease or illness, as well as what they feel like has caused the issue or could be causing the issue continuously. So with those things in mind, that's what you're considering here for this explanatory process, as well as with the doctor themselves taking that into their own perspective to explain more in depth to the patient to what those mean or how they apply it to them, that is once again relevant to their own cultural and societal backgrounds. And this does go further in depth too with things like the treatment process, because this is going to be different from person to person. They're going to be seeing the treatment process differently from person to person once again. So things like modern medicine might not always be something that's acceptable or something that they want to pursue, because they're going to find it as something that is more risky or something that they're just not comfortable doing at all. So more often than not, they're going to pursue things like home remedies. Like I come from an Hispanic background. You might not perceive that, but one of our things for curing a common cold was Vicks on your feet. You put Vicks on your feet and you're going to feel better in the morning. So that's an example of things that they might pursue. While that may be more comfortable to them, they might not be comfortable with taking allergy medications, those sorts of things. So that's something a doctor has to keep into perspective with the scope of how the patient views their illness or disease themselves, while also the doctor being able to effectively communicate to the patient how these things matter within the larger scope of what the illness or disease is, kind of tying that back into that last point once again, and what those mean to the patient, while being able to effectively climb those communication barriers, those cultural differences, as well as those, once again, language barriers too, because it's not going to be the same thing from person to person. And a lot of this is done through that patient-first perspective. So pursuing this with, open-ended questions, things like, how severe is your sickness? What's the kind of result you want from this treatment? Or what do you feel like caused this sickness, this sort of thing, that allows the patient to be patient first in terms of how they want to perceive their own illness or speak about their own illness as well in a way that's comfortable to them.